So this week we're heading back out to sea, and I'll be genuinely interested to see how well you guys think this episode goes down. So far, the most popular of the episodes we've done by some margin have been Mendacious and Malediction. I don't know if that's some sort of strange phenomenon about episode titles that start with the letter M, or if it's about the fact that you've got large numbers of enemies involved in the conflict. I've got no idea. So we'll have to see what the feedback is like when it comes to the use of our immortal serial killer villain. I guess the genesis for Luke Quinn comes from a horror novel I read when I was a teenager called Savage by Richard Lehman. And in that story, Jack the Ripper's identity gets deduced and he escapes capture in London by hopping on a fast boat over to America. And when he gets there, he takes refuge in the Midwest, carries on with his murderous antics, and it gets blamed on the Native American tribes that live there. Leading on quite nicely from that was a movie I'd watched called Ravenous from 1998, where Robert Carlyle goes crazy out in the wilderness and turns to cannibalism, taking on a unit of disgruntled US cavalry soldiers at the same time. And those ideas just went well together. The idea of a serial killer and cannibalism out in the wilds. Those ideas of a serial killer hiding in plain sight really got under my skin. And over time, the idea just morphed into this representation of a truly evil creature, someone or something that's been around pretty much since the dawn of time, and has either directly or indirectly contributed to some of the world's most horrifying crimes in the process. Whilst I'm pretty obsessed with World War II, there are some other military history events that have pulled me in, and the massacre of the Roman armies in the Teutoburg Forest is one of those. I think that one interests me even more than the loss of the Ninth Legion, which is usually the most popular. So having decided that Lucius was going to be a Roman survivor of that and was going to pass through the ages, really what he turned into was a whistle-stop tour of all the mysterious serial killings and slayings that I've written scripts for on bedtime stories. And that includes The Man from the Train and Hunter Kaifek. As ever, this episode is absolutely nothing without Sean and the artwork he produces. For that scene where Lucius gets introduced, I stole a play straight out of Rich's playbook from the episode There's Something in the Mountain, which is where you have 3 or 4 characters stood next to each other on screen and slowly pan from left to right to reveal them travelling through the ages. And my initial brief to Sean was just to have 3 shadowy outlines of Lucius and have him defined by what era he's in, depending on what weapon or clothing he's wearing. Thankfully, Sean just completely switched that up to the 3 detailed views of our scumbag that we used. And I really, really love what he came up with. Alongside that, the final image he came up with of the body floating under the water, that for me is one of my favourite pieces that he's done for the channel so far. For this episode, it was really, really great having Sean come up with his own ideas for the art rather than me just briefing him on them. And I'm pleased to tease that he's going to be getting a bit more involved as we go forward. Our next episode is going to be our first short story, and that's a story that not only has he come up with, but I'm giving him full creative control over the art as well. As ever, having come up with a monster, the tricky question was where to insert him in World War II. And for me, the story of Convoy HX-84 is about as heroic and tragic in equal measure as they come. With the exception of the Bickley Bridge and her crew, all the ships and the captains featured in the story are real, and the description of the battle is pretty much how it played out in real life. The Jervis Bay, which was the convoy escort, never really stood a prayer against the Admiral Scheer, but the lucky shot that she got off that took out the Scheer's radar doubtlessly saved countless lives during the coming slaughter. Likewise, the Beaverford had no business sacrificing herself to buy the rest of the convoy breathing space. She was a cargo ship with 1 gun, It was only ever going to go one way, but her captain, her crew laid down their lives to save the others. It's not without controversy, the idea of Hugh Pettigrew and his ship. The story of him playing cat and mouse with the Scheer came from the survivors of the other ships in the convoy, and was then picked up in the British press to highlight the heroism rather than the tragedy. In Captain Cranker's logs, he claims that it didn't happen. He says he engaged a tanker which was difficult. It was difficult to sink because it was laden with timber, which was keeping it afloat, and so he wasted time torpedoing it, and that's what took up the time rather than a David and Goliath fight. It's hard to see who's lying here. Is it the Germans trying to put face on the fact that they didn't really sink that many ships? Is it the Allies trying to turn a tragedy into an inspirational story? I don't know. All I do hope is that by telling the story of the Beaverford, it keeps the story of HX-84 alive, and in doing so, it highlights their actions and keeps people interested and keeps the story going. After her little brief sortie out into the Atlantic, the Scheer was deployed to Norway alongside the Tirpitz, and she spent several years out there before she ended up transferred out to assist the German forces who were retreating from the Russians on the Eastern Front. She was used as a floating battery, and she shelled the ground positions so much over the years that her guns were pretty much knackered towards the end and needed replacing because she just constantly bombarding Soviet targets. She was also used to evacuate soldiers and civilians from the conflict zones on the coast, and her luck lasted until April 1945, when she was at anchor in the shipyards in Kiel, and the Allies caught up with her and bombed her. The ship capsized, rolled, and couldn't be salvaged. So that was the end of the Scheer. Following on from his command of the Scheer, Theodor Kranker was promoted to an admiral. He was in charge of all of the German naval forces stationed in France when the Allies invaded on D-Day, and he survived the war and passed away in 1973. Last, but by no means least, Bickley Bridge is indeed a real place, and it is located in mid-Devon in the UK. There's not much to it other than a narrow bridge that passes over the River Exe, midway between Exeter and the town of Tiverton. One slightly odd story attached to it is that the locals there have in the past claimed that the bridge was the inspiration for the song Bridge Over Troubled Water. I should point out that, having done a bit of research, there's nothing to support that claim whatsoever. But it is a place that I happen to have a loose association with through work, which is why it managed to make its way into the story as the name of the tanker. Anyway, as ever, whatever your feelings on this episode, please feed them back to me. I'm desperately trying to keep as much variety in the stories as I can, because nobody needs any more Nazi zombie super soldiers in their life. If it's working, great. If it isn't working, then please let me know. I'd appreciate the steer, and I'll try and fix it and push it another way. Anyway, thanks for your time, and hopefully I will see you guys next time around.